Thanks so much for joining me today. We are live on LinkedIn and YouTube, and hope people are tuning in and they're going to enjoy this conversation because I know I will. I always enjoy speaking with you. So I'll just do a quick introduction of myself in case people watching don't know who I am, and then I would love for you to introduce yourself. So I'm Laurie Barkman. I'm the CEO and founder of SmallDotBig, and I work with business owners to help them maximize the value of their company and be super excited and happy in their next venture. And I'm joined today by Jacquelyn Core. Jacquelyn, hello.
Hi, thanks for joining us. My name is Jacquelyn Core. I'm a partner at the Lynch Law Group, where I co-chair our firm's corporate practice group. I have primarily a mergers and acquisitions practice, so I love talking about buying and selling businesses. It's super fun for me. And then the remainder of my practice is working really as fractional in-house counsel for companies and doing contracts work and corporate work for business clients. So I'm super excited to be here with you and do this again, Laurie. We had so much fun the last time we did a LinkedIn Live. And so I know this is a topic that really is near and dear to your heart and so close to what you do, and a space that you can make such a big impact for business owners. So I'm super excited to talk about this today.
Thanks, Jacquelyn. I appreciate that. So yeah, just teeing up today's episode, we wanted to talk about how you can personally plan for a business transition. And that sounds really complicated, right? How do you plan for a transition? So Jacquelyn and I are going to unpack that a little bit, but I wanted to tee it up with a couple of pieces of data that you might not be familiar with. A lot of people are thinking about their timelines. How long do they want to stay in their business? And many business owners prior to COVID, the most common response we would hear about is about 10 years. And what we're seeing is an acceleration of that timeline, that because of the multiple recessions people have been through, business owners have been through, 2001, 2008, 9, and now with COVID in 2020, there is an interest to transition ownership. And so what we're seeing is a trend towards 5 years or less. And so what does that mean? That's easier said than done. And people are contemplating options, but many business owners are not yet familiar with the exit planning process or transition planning process. One number that surprised me, I don't know if this surprised you, Jacquelyn, when I was looking at the data, only 2 out of every 10 companies actually sell, the ones that try to sell and go on the market. Imagine if those were houses, right? And we had all this unsold inventory. But people who want to sell their company really need to have a sellable company. That's where it starts. And so I'm motivated to help business owners make their company sellable and understand what can make them successful. And the other part of this, and Jacquelyn, we can certainly talk about it, as we go through this today, is there is some survey data out there from the Exit Planning Institute where they survey business owners 1 year after they've sold their company. And a very high percentage, like 75%, express regret in selling. And there's a number of reasons for that. But ultimately, what can we do, you, me, and other advisors who work with business owners to help them in understanding not only what the process is, but what their, how will this benefit them and how can they really be ready? So that's the backdrop. So let me first ask you, a question to get the conversation going. You talk to so many business owners in your practice. What do you think are some of the key questions that business owners should be prepared to answer when they start thinking about this type of transition?
Yeah, well, I think that to your point about what we're going to talk about today, one of the big issues really is this issue of personal readiness in addition to business readiness. So I think there are 2 separate questions. And one is your business ready to sell? And so to your point, and to what you help a lot of people do, on the value building side, what's the value of your business? Are you ready to market it? And does it look like a business that somebody would want to buy? So do you have your best foot forward? And so is your business ready is kind of the first question. And then the second really is, are you ready? And that's not just, are you ready to move on to something else? Because a lot of people are ready to move on to something else, but there is a whole process involved, this kind of mental process of getting ready to move on and having a plan. And, one of the things we see, we have some clients who come to us to sell their business and they already know what their next plan is. And those plans vary greatly depending on the people. So sometimes it's they have another business that they really want to be involved in, or they want to buy another business. Sometimes it's they're ready for retirement, they want to travel, or they want to spend time taking care of their grandkids, or spend time with their family. And then other people say, I don't have any idea what I'm going to do. And I think that there's such a higher level of regret among those people that don't have a personal plan, because they haven't really thought through. And so, those are kind of the two big questions, the 20,000 foot view questions. And we can get into the weeds and dig a little bit into what that looks like, of course, but today we're focusing on that personal side. And I think then the second question is your timeline. What's your timeline look like? Because in terms of readiness, you have to not just have your head wrapped around it, but the timing has to be right for you, right? And we see people who said they stayed in it for too long. We see people who regret that they think they exited too early. We see people who stayed because they weren't mentally ready to leave, but they missed a great opportunity. So they maybe missed an opportunity to maximize the value of the company because they weren't personally ready. And sometimes that's even okay, right? But it can lead to regret.
Yeah.
And so, kind of going through that planning, and one of the exciting things that we've had going on is this new, M&A advisory panel, which, we can tell listeners a little bit about that. We've been getting together to kind of help business owners who are looking to sell, first of all, put that team together to help them get across the finish line. And that M&A advisory panel, of course, being, a group of trusted advisors, many of us affiliated with Vistage, or all of us affiliated with Vistage in some way or another, who are familiar and have experience in the M&A process that can really help familiarize that process for people and can have a real big impact, I think, on that personal readiness component.
Yeah, and it's funny because I've so many people, when you ask them, what's your timeline of ownership? And I have a survey where I ask people that question when I'm getting to know them and help them understand kind of diagnostically where is their business today. And so that question is quite simply, what's your time horizon? And on average, and I do workshops for Vistage groups, and these groups are like 15 to 18, 20 people sometimes. And on average, I see about 11 years. And it's kind of like, all right, about 11 years is when I'm ready for a transition. And so then some people they're not ready to talk about it. It's when they're really kind of in almost like this 5-year window. But I think conceptually, Jacquelyn, one of the messages for today for folks could be, hey, it's okay if you don't know yet how you want to transition your company, but let's acknowledge it's going to happen. And you and I a little bit later, we're going to talk about what some of those transition options are for people. And so part of today, I think, is just conversation just to educate a little bit about, well, what are some of the things to start thinking about? And it's not like you have to start today if you're transitioning 10, 15, 20 years from now, of course. But a big premise in all of this is the work that you're going to do to get your business ready for sale is essentially good economic work. And yes, there's trade-offs maybe in some of the decision making you would have along the way, but just having that perspective. And then this other thing, kind of cognitive psychology wise, is we as humans, when we participate in something, we believe in it because we're actively participating. And so we call this cognitive dissonance, right? If you do not believe in a cause, but then you start to participate in it, then over time, guess what? You really are buying into it because you're actively part of it. And I think the same thing about transition planning. It's hard sometimes to even think about it and think about leaving your company, especially if your name is on the door, right? And having that identity tied in. And so the personal readiness side can come with the act of working on a transition. And so it's almost like this graph over time. You're going to spend more and more time on it. But again, no matter where you are in this curve of time, the reality is that at some point in your future, you will have a transition. How and when, and all of that will come later. But I think it's important to know.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Laurie, one of the things that people often, I think if they were pressed, they could give a timeline. but it's one of those, if I don't talk about it, it's not really happening kind of things. And
Yeah.
so, in terms of like your personal goal setting, like you might know where you want to be. People ask you, where do you want to be in your career? Well, it's no different for business owners, right? Where do you want to be in your business 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road? And then the next question is, where do you want the business to be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road? But the next question is then, where are you in that plan? Right? So you have a goal for the business 10 years down the road. Are you still in the picture?
Right.
Right? Are you in the same role you're in now? Right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that it's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not you're in the business or you're out of the business forever and you never have anything to do with it again. And so there are, some options surrounding that and options for transition. But to your point, one of the things we hear people say in transactions, and I think it's people with the lowest level of readiness, is that they feel like they've been hit by a tidal wave. And it's because there was no setup, right? And so it's like, this is part of setting yourself up for success in this process. And even if you think you're 3 years, 5 years, even 8 or 10 years out, finding out what your options are for exit, finding out what the process of exiting looks like, what's an M&A transaction look like? What's it look like to get my business ready? What are people going to consider when they look at my business and look at the value? Just knowing those things so that you don't have that cognitive dissonance about the process of selling your business, I think can be really empowering and can really decrease that threshold of anxiety that people have when it's time to sell.
Yeah, because why does that matter? Well, if you worked so hard to get your company ready, you've probably engaged a third-party advisor an M&A advisor. They're working on your behalf to represent you to the buyer. There might be a strategic buyer, there might be a financial buyer. Everybody's working on your behalf. And then when it's time to sign, imagine that deal falling apart, right? It's disappointing all around. Now, obviously, it's ultimately up to the seller to sell. But that is something we try to avoid. We want to make sure that through the process, people are really making decisions as they go. And we have kind of these decision gates. Go, no go. Yep, keep going. Or, oh, we got to go back and keep working on something. And we're not ready yet. Okay, go back. And that's kind of a 90-day, to 180-day cycle where when we're in the planning phase to really be checking in on readiness, whether it's personal, financial, or business.
And I want to talk with you, and I want you to talk with the listeners about quantifying that kind of readiness. But before we do that, maybe we could talk just really briefly about kind of who the people are that you might need on your team to get this done. Because as we were putting together this, M&A advisory panel, this group of people who might advise a seller and start to talk about this transition process, we all really sat down and had a lot, we added people to the mix kind of even later to say, who are all the pieces? What are all the pieces somebody could need? And not everybody will need every piece. But, I think people think I need a lawyer to sell my business, and maybe I need an accountant. And a lot of people think that's all they need. Yeah. And, the beauty of that panel is that there is somebody like you that can help them build value, that there is a wealth manager. A lot of people, when they're thinking about this, they don't know how much money they need to retire. And that, of course, is a huge part of financial readiness. What's that number in your head that you really need to move on to your next thing? Or maybe it's not retirement, maybe it's buying another business, right? But how much money do you need to accomplish that? Have you planned that? We have somebody involved in human capital, because you have to think about the people. And that might be if you have a business and there are people whose jobs you want to protect in the business. Maybe it's a relative of yours that works in the business. Maybe it's a junior partner or somebody who you've kind of brought up in the business and you want to make sure they're protected in the transition. And you need to be able to articulate the value of those people to a new owner. So just really trying to put together, and then a marketing person. And that's really, I think, one that a lot of people don't think about at all. What's the first thing that someone looks at if they think they might want to buy your business? Well, they look at your webpage.
Yeah, of course.
And how many people designed their webpage to appeal to a seller or a buyer of their business, right? That's not why we design our web pages, right? It's all about product and our services. And so you could have a great web page that still looks great to a prospective buyer, but you really need to kind of be very intentional and think about that and say, what's that look like, right? What should that web page look like? What information should be on there? Let's make sure you don't have broken links. Let's make sure that it looks professional, that it looks like a business that's positioned for growth. And so those are kind of all important, parts of the team. But I just want to circle back and ask you to talk a little bit about, because there are great ways to quantify this personal readiness. And so I wonder if you could tell listeners a little bit more about that, because I think that's a super valuable thing for people to know, like, how can I figure out whether I'm ready?
Yeah, and you're right, because there's shades of gray. And so what I offer, and I'll offer to anyone who's listening as an invitation, is they can take this questionnaire. It's an online questionnaire. I assure you it's not painful. It is going to be thought-provoking though, and it's certainly worth having a discussion after you've taken it, but it'll take you about 15 minutes. And it's a way to quantify your personal readiness and also identify potential risk factors that you might encounter. So that statistic that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion here today was that 75% of business owners express some unhappiness after selling. And what we've done with this survey tool that I use called the Value Builder System is that diagnostic tool has created 4 sets of drivers, right? Learning from some of the reasons why people are unhappy after the sale and breaking it into these 4 drivers. So the questions that you'll answer will, at the end of it, we'll look at the responses in these 4 categories. And I'll just kind of cover the 4 real high level, Jacquelyn, and they're on the similar themes of what you and I've been talking about, but just to have the context here. The first one is future vision. So questions like, why do you want to exit your business? And what do you plan to do after you leave your company? That's this looking forward part that's really, really important, because there's pull factors and there's push factors. And so the more pull factors you have, things that you're excited about, things that you're pulling into. I've talked to so many people on my podcast, Succession Stories, about their next, and people who have created multi-million-dollar companies, sold them, and then what do they want to do next? Well, sometimes they just want to spend time with their family. They've been traveling all these years. They just want to kind of lay low. Other people want to buy another company, but regardless of what that is, maybe they want to set up a family office. Having that sense of next is really important. The second one we call structuring flexibility. So questions like, how much is your business worth to you? And what's your bottom line? Like, what's that bottom line net number after taxes, fees, etc.? Have you considered the practical financial questions surrounding your exit or your transition? And Jacquelyn, you mentioned this collaborative panel of professionals that we've assembled for business owners to talk to and get it's actually, we didn't mention the detail here, but it's a complimentary 50-minute session with this group to ask them some of these questions and probe to get the business owner thinking about, what some possible next steps might be. And this is part of it, right? From the financial side, is understanding these numbers are equally important. The third one is personal detachment. So how attached are you personally? Your social fabric, is it all about the company? And maybe it's because it's family, or maybe because it's just you really love the people and your friends, you have great culture. But have you built a fulfilling life outside of the company? How many people do you know, Jacquelyn, that have gotten divorced, at some tenure in running their company? They end up becoming married to their company, and unfortunately, the spouse has, the relationship has deteriorated. So conceptually here, what we're talking about is, for some people, this transition is going to feel like a divorce from their company. It's very emotional, right? It can be very emotional. And there's obviously ups and downs in that. So the personal detachment is part of it, especially if your name is on the door, family business, or you're the founder. And then the last one has to do with people too, which is your team involvement, and your consideration for how they will be treated when you leave your company is a big part of it too, like potentially why you might be unhappy. And we can talk about different transition options, Jacquelyn. I think that might help people in understanding pros and cons of that, because depending on what your goals are around this team side of what your vision is and sustainability of the business might direct you towards some options of transition and away from other options for that reason. So it's just really important, so at the outset, to talk about that vision and their goals, because there's a world of possibilities out there. There's no one way to transition your company. What we want to do is advise you on the best way that fits you and meeting your goals. So that's kind of the 4 drivers in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I one of the things I want to bring up is that sometimes, and it seems probably obvious to us and people who work in the M&A field, but something that surprises buyers is the cash-free, debt-free nature of many transactions, right? And so there's debt on the business, and many sellers are surprised to find out that the buyer is not going to take on that debt. And so, in their head, they have this plan. So before they've talked to advisors, they have this plan that they'll sell the business. And if there's a mortgage on the business, that the buyer will just keep paying that mortgage. And that is not how it works in the vast majority of sales. And so to talk about what you were talking about, the number, right? And making sure that at the end, your net number is a number that works, knowing what has to come out of your sale price. I think a lot of people do this personal planning surrounding the sale price of the business and not thinking about, capital gains taxes potentially coming out of the sales price. If it's a corporation and money's being paid to them being taxed on the income. So a double taxation, event, depending on the type of sale, they don't think about that. They don't think about having to pay the debt off out of the check that they get, right? And so people think, well, I'm going to sell my business for $6 million, so I'm getting $6 million. No.
Net.
As many M&A transactions, there has never been one, where you're getting $6 million means you're getting a check for $6 million. It never means that. And so, I certainly don't mean that to be discouraging in any way to sellers, but, having a realistic picture of what the sale looks like, what you can expect to have after the sale, how you can maximize that or maybe increase that number, right? These are all things that contribute to readiness, because if you have not thought those things through in advance and you're having these realizations at the 11th hour, so if you haven't worked with someone and haven't talked about this, often there'll be things that they need to fix as a part of the sale. Somebody will come in and say, you have an environmental issue and you have to clean up this environmental issue before you can sell the business. Or there's a tax lien that is 40 years old that nobody knew about, and you're going to have to pay it before you can sell the business. And so really having done your diligence, we also talk about the legal diligence process, but your personal diligence, your financial diligence, right? To know what that transaction is going to look like, it makes a big difference, to your point. Yeah. And so those 4 drivers, super important considerations. And I think it's important to say the same driver isn't going to be high for everyone, right? Yeah. So, as you look at those, maybe, you might love your team, but not be concerned about their future because they're all really capable people that are integral to the business and they're going to be fine. So you don't have to worry about that too much, right? Yeah. Or your kids might be working in the business and you have to worry about it a lot. Yeah. And so it's just going to vary. And that's part of what makes, what makes this process so personal.
It's very, very personal. And I think it's important to recognize that and give it the air time that it needs. And I should go back to this invitation. So if you're not driving, don't write this down while you're driving, but if if you want to write this down, the URL from an invitation standpoint is get my PreScore, that's PRE.com, getmyprescore.com. And pre means personal readiness to exit. So that's the acronym. So if you go to that page, you'll see the survey there, and you can take that. And I will meet with you to discuss your answers. And the quantifying nature of it is each of these dimensions, each of these drivers is on a point score. So what can we learn from where you are today, and what might exercises and thought starters can we give you to help you in thinking through this process? And again, I like to say it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And you don't have to have all the answers right now, and that's okay. But we got to start the conversation.
And I think it's important to point out that's a confidential process, right?
Absolutely.
And so people don't have to announce at work that they're gonna take the personal readiness to exit test, right?
No.
You don't have to talk about that at home over the dinner table, right? You can do this to kind of see where you are and get a benchmark as to how ready you might be, and maybe get a little direction in your head of what the next few years, should look like to help you be more ready. You can do that even if you're not yet thinking about exiting.
Yeah, just again, I think it's kind of like this mental map of starting to understand the process. You've never been through this process before, let's say, but it's going to be the biggest transaction of your life. And is that the kind of thing you want to learn about 24 hours in advance? No, of course not, right? We are all students of our world. And in this world of mergers and acquisitions, if you haven't been spending any time in it, there's a lot to learn. And we're all still learning. I mean, Jacquelyn, you're a professional, and I guarantee you're still learning things as you go
every day.
Every day. So I think that's really the point. And again, surrounding yourself with some trusted advisors that can help you along the path. But yeah, so maybe we can shift forward, Jacquelyn. I wanted to ask you, because I know you talk to so many people, and they probably think, oh yeah, it's in this far future space. I don't need to worry about that now. But then you hear these horror stories of where people just were not ready and something came at them because of either a death or, something that you just can't plan for. So no matter what the reason is for that transition, again, we hope to be able to plan for these things, but what do you think are some of the main reasons why business owners might want to start putting plans in place now and not wait until they're quote unquote ready? Because how do we even know when we're ready?
Yeah. I think that there are a number of reasons, Laurie. The most graphic of them is that if you start thinking about your readiness now and preparing for what a transition might look like, if you have an unexpected transition, it can go better. And one of the things we unfortunately see are businesses that end up closing the doors because the primary business owner dies or gets sick unexpectedly, and the family doesn't know anything about running the business, and there is not another key person in place who can really take over the business. The business isn't ready to sell. And as a result, what happens is there's a precipitous decline. And before they can get the business ready to sell, they get on that downward path and they end up closing the doors, or it ends up being an asset sale where they're just selling off the stock of what they have, and they lose a lot of value in the company. And so, because this is very personal, we're talking about personal readiness. A lot of people don't want to talk about this transition because it is so closely tied to aging for a lot of people, right? And so people don't want to think about their own mortality. They don't want to think about a time when they're not going to be around. And we were just talking about this at lunch yesterday, that there are a lot of businesses that transition on death. Yeah. So and that's not always because the business owner has worked until they're 95, right? And so things happen, and so a couple things happen here. One is that there hasn't been any planning, which is obviously the one of the big obstacles. But the other is that the business gets tied up in an estate. And so the thing that you get to avoid if you transition the business before death is that you get to avoid one, it being transitioned as a part of the estate and maybe it gets caught up in the probate process, right? And so that can be a real problem. It gets subject to inheritance tax in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So not all states have inheritance tax, but here in Pennsylvania we do. And that inheritance tax, depending on who the business is going to, can be significant. It can be millions of dollars.
Wow.
And people don't realize it.
Is there a percentage? Is there like a range?
It can be as much as, it can be more than 10%.
Wow.
Depending on the beneficiary. And you know, there are exemptions and there are ways to plan that transition. And there are ways for people to stay involved in the business and still plan the transition. And so often, you know, we'll take businesses, particularly in family transitions, and this starts to maybe get into the kinds of transitions that we could have. But in family transitions, often, if we have a generation coming up or there's a younger spouse that's going to take over the business, you know, we can transition ownership to be as joint tenants with right of survivorship. So people kind of automatically get this business if there's a catastrophic event. And so there are ways to structure it. And I don't want to get too, technical and complex, but there are ways to structure it. There are ways to structure it within an estate to help relieve some of the tax burden. But also to make sure that the business does not become a business that's not a going concern because there's nobody to attend to it immediately following death, or there are too many unknown things. It's not uncommon at all for business owners to not know where even their basic corporate documents are.
Maybe they were created 40 years ago.
That's right. I mean, sometimes we're dealing with, to your point with the Succession Stories podcast, you're talking about sometimes you're interviewing business owners, that are 3 or 4 generations of the business. And while those are amazing stories, they also mean that maybe nobody knows where those documents are.
I interviewed a Generation 10 business, Jacquelyn. Do you think they know?
Yeah, and they might have everything locked down, and they might be able to reach onto their shelf and pull off that binder. I mean, businesses we represent, we have a copy of all their corporate documents. We maintain a bound copy, like a 3-ring binder copy of all of their corporate documents. And so if they need them, if they lose them, if there's a flood, there's all kinds of situations where people can't find these. They had them saved electronically, the computer crashed, they can't retrieve the documents. Lots of things happen. So we tell everybody, please keep a paper copy and please keep an electronic copy. And then please put a copy somewhere not at the business, right? At home in your safe, at home on your shelf, wherever, right? Give one to someone else in the company. But even those basic kinds of things can mean that if someone who is a business owner dies catastrophically, there might not even be people who can sign the checks.
Yeah.
And so keeping the business going functionally, let alone planning for a transition at that really difficult time, is not ideal. And so as much as we don't want to think about our own mortality, there's a lot of benefit to really taking some time to plan. And what we hear business owners say when we do this kind of estate planning with business owners is we hear people say at the end that they're relieved because they know that a burden has been taken off their family. And that's how I always encourage people to frame it for themselves. So in terms of personal readiness to talk about this, to plan a family transition, which is one of the ways you can transition your business, is to think about that planning process as being in and of itself a gift that you can give to people in your family, to say, everything's going to be all ready to go. And if something happens to me, I'm not going to have left my family scrambling. Either the business will be ready to sell if that's what we want, or the business will be ready for them to take over, and we'll have the provisions in place that we need to have in place for a smooth transition.
Yeah, family businesses are interesting, right? Because especially if you are 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and so on, And obviously that gets more rare. Most companies don't make it to the third generation, only about 8% do. But at that point, they probably have a vision for sustainability. There was a conversation I had with the CEO of Highlights for Children. You remember that magazine? And it's all about sustainable future. And he even said, I don't want to have a culture that's so dependent on and influenced by one person. I thought that was really powerful because this concept of even having everything be transferable, including the culture, right? That it's not beholden to one individual, is this ongoing concern, sustainable business that many family businesses have that sense of identity and they want to keep it going. And so they're motivated to increase the value of their company so that it is worth more to the next generation. But it's complex, as you said. It's not an easy thing, especially when there's more cousins and maybe you have operator, owners, and they don't have, some other parts of the business, you talk to them at Thanksgiving dinner, or maybe they have a family council. So a lot of companies are really, they're governed differently too. So family businesses, I know that's a specialty for some advisors, to be focused on particular issues and nuances. But I think thematically, there's also a lot of things we can learn from it, even if you're the founder, right? So if you're the founder of a company and you didn't create your company designed for your son or daughter to come into the business, but lo and behold, they did. And so now you're passing the baton to the next generation. That's an exciting thing. You probably feel great about that, but there's a lot of implications, as you said, Jacquelyn. And so sometimes these companies are more akin to planning ahead because there is that sense of this baton pass, from either, again, father to son or sometimes to the daughters. More and more we're seeing that. And again, it's not easy. There's still emotion there, but at least it's within the same family. You don't have questions of who's this company going to, considerations for the employees, right? As we talked about, sort of a sense of we're family, we want to make sure our employees are taken care of. A transition to the next generation, if we kick off our conversation here about, well, what are transition options? Number one is to transition the family.
Right.
And obviously there's pros and cons. You and I just talked through a bunch. But yeah, I think that's a big one.
Yeah. And, I think the next kind of biggest category, obviously beyond family transition, is what we think of as typical acquisitions, right? You're going to, in some way, merge into another entity or be purchased by another entity. And that can look very different depending on the buyer and depending on your concerns. So if you think about those 4 drivers of readiness, that may make some buyers good for you and other buyers not, right? And so private equity buyers, for example, it depends a lot on which private equity buyer you have as to what their intention is going to be with the company. They're looking for an internal rate of return, which means for the most part, they're not going to keep companies for a long time. They're going to be bought. They're going to go through a period of growth and then be sold. Sometimes in some private equity acquisitions, companies get dismantled. And so, are you worried about your people? Are you worried about your name on the door and the legacy aspect? And so that might not make particular kinds, and I certainly don't mean to pick on private equity here because private equity does a lot to provide growth. And one of the great things that happens often is when a lot of people exit because they say, I can't take the company any further. I've done all I can do for it. And that's not a negative thing, right? It's either more capital is required, it's greater expertise is required than I can bring into the company. It's in order for the company to grow, we'd have to increase markets. And maybe you even could, but aren't willing to do that. I mean, there are lots of reasons why you might not want to grow the company any bigger than it is right now. And so, it can be a real growth strategy. But when you think about that acquisition, you can be purchased by somebody who is going to be an operator. You could be purchased by somebody who wants you to continue to operate the business, right? You could be purchased by somebody who is a strategic buyer. So in some way, what you do really benefits their business, right? And so, this is when the ice cream company buys the dairy farm.
Right.
right? And so if you think about your chain of distribution, you could be acquired by a competitor, somebody who wants your customer list or your book of business or wants your geographic territory. You can be acquired for your people. Maybe you have brilliant scientists and people want to buy your people. And so these are all within that category, the general category of merger or acquisition, just the sale of your business to somebody, but lots of different kinds of buyers in that space, providing really lots of different structures and options, for the sale of your company.
Yeah, and just to kind of put a little period at the end of the sentence there and summarize, I think the two main categories would be strategic and financial. And then the other one, as a segue, you mentioned, is for when a company gets bought because of their people and their technical skills, we call that an acqui-hire. And so that's another type of acquisition that you'll see typically for technology companies, such as Oculus Rift when they were bought by Facebook, right? They were really acquiring that know-how and the technology. And then those folks are, kind of merged into a larger entity. And so those are pretty interesting. I mean, I've also been part of a company that did an acqui-hire strategy, not only because they wanted the business and as a bolt-on, but there was the added benefit from a succession planning standpoint for senior management. And that was a big part of that acquisition too. So there's another option that we see sometimes, which is existing management buys out the owners. And there was a recent example of friends of mine here in the city. It's a marketing services firm, and the founder sold it to his two second in command that have been with him a long time. It was very, very exciting for them. And so there's other examples of that where the management team wants to buy out the company. The real pros and cons, right? But the pro to that is that you've got people who know the organization. You're not airing all your confidential information to a third party because these are people who already know the business and they know the risks and they know the potential. And then also, the downside is, are you leaving money on the table? You don't know, and you're not sort of shopping the offer around. But this is a very, again, one of those main options that might really fit your business vision.
Yeah, I mean, I think you get a great continuity of operations there, because usually management hires don't turn everything upside down. They're familiar with the operations of the business, and they're part of the reason it's operating the way it's operating now. And so you get this continuity of transition there. I think one of the things to keep in mind about management transitions is that sometimes people will say, I never thought of that person because I didn't think they'd have the money, right? Or I didn't think they would be able to afford it. And this is another reason to start planning early, because a lot of times people will take what might be otherwise a bonus structure, right? Or some portion of compensation, and they'll defer that compensation to allow that person to build the equity that they need to build to buy the company. And people do that many, many years in advance. I mean, we see sometimes people do that 10 years in advance, where they've made a decision that somebody's going to buy the company in 10 years. And so they're deferring compensation to build this nest egg of money that they can use to acquire the company. And so planning can really change the dynamic as to whether somebody in the management could or couldn't purchase the company. And so if, to your point about being prepared, if you're not talking about this and you're not thinking about it, if you spring it on your number two in command, the month before you want to sell the business, hey, do you want to buy? You might have created a situation where they don't have enough time to react. And so that's also one of the reasons to be thinking early, because it allows you to explore these kinds of options to get you over some of the hurdles that you might have.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's run through some of these other options real quick, because I think there's a few more we wanted to cover. And so in addition to selling the management, you could sell to an existing partner or an investor. And it's sort of similar situation as the management team, where you're not airing everything out to a third party. And your legacy may be more likely to be preserved because they're already part of the business and the culture. It might be more tricky for you to stay involved if that's one of the things that's important to you. And also you have the risk of they don't want to buy your shares and it could also end up being, contentious situation. So there could be some potential problems. And I don't know if you've run into any of those dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, we sure have. And a lot of that also gets driven by the fact that that's a more, to your point about strategic or financial buyer, that's typically a more financial buyer, right? And so the negotiation over price can be difficult, and you might not have as objective of an analysis as to business value, when you have those people on the inside. And so that's one of the things that can make it tricky.
Yeah.
One of the other options are options that involve public acquisition. So an IPO, a public offering, or we're seeing more and more SPACs right now. And so you and I have talked about that, the popularity of SPACs. These are special purpose acquisition. And so developed really to invest and buy. And so these are kind of new arrivals on the scene. And one of the things that I'll mention here too, when we talk about investors, if I'll jump back up to investor for 1 second to say, we're seeing more and more non-control capital. So typically investors, when they're going to buy into a business, they're going to want a controlling share in the business. And so they're going to want to buy more than 50%. Or very close to 50%, but to be given control through board seats or, other mechanisms. But they're going to want controlling capital. And we're seeing more and more people, there's so much money in the investment market right now that we're really seeing a rise of non-control capital. And so that also can be another option that allows people to stay in the business, to your point about wanting to, stay involved. So investor can make it difficult, but non-control capital can be an investor option that allows you to stay involved.
Yeah. Now let's talk about some options that aren't as pleasant. One is liquidation and the other is bankruptcy. Now, of course, in the world of options, we don't wish these upon people, but sometimes these are the options, right?
Yeah.
So, in liquidation, what does that mean? Essentially, you're selling off the assets. You're selling it off to, get as much in the free market as you can. Sometimes it could be an auction. You're not going to get the biggest return on this option. And it also could mean from a relationship standpoint that there's some severing happening, right? You're severing relationships with suppliers, with employees, anyone else who's been involved. It's just not necessarily a great outcome. And likewise, for bankruptcy, it's going to relieve you of this responsibility and debts of your business. It's going to enable you to move on. But at the same time, you might not be able to relieve all your debts, and it could affect your ability to borrow in the future. And so again, it may also negatively affect some of the relationships that you've worked so hard to build, whether it's your family, with customers, again, with suppliers. And then we have one more, Jacquelyn, kind of in the last but not least category. It's an ESOP. So we probably should talk about ESOP. I know it's a little less common, but it is out there, where you can sell your shares to an ESOP, which is an employee stock ownership plan. What are your sense about pros and cons from your experience about ESOPs?
Yeah, so there are certainly tax benefits to ESOPs, and that's what makes it attractive. We used to see tons and tons of ESOPs. There was a time where it seemed like every business was an ESOP. And then they declined in popularity for a while, and now I think we're seeing more of them. And I think you mentioned you're seeing more of them as well. One of the cons, which isn't necessarily a reason not to do it, but a consideration, is that there are significant auditing and reporting requirements involved, and the auditing costs, the annual auditing costs for ESOPs can be substantial. And so you really I would say with ESOPs, you have to really look at the financial. There are big financial pros and some financial cons. So you just have to look at that and evaluate it and see how it shakes out. But a lot of times it's a great way, to save a business. And one real pro of it is if you really can get the employees behind you, those employees tend to be very invested then in the success of the business. So, ESOP employees sometimes make great workers, right? Because they're working for themselves now. So that's definitely an added benefit of it for sure.
Yeah, it changes the mindset. It's kind of an ESOP is really part of the culture. And for more resources on ESOP, you can check out my podcast. I actually have an episode that launched today, an interview with an attorney, Christy Britch, who specializes in ESOP. So it's a great conversation, especially if you want to learn more. I encourage you to check it out. So I guess kind of winding down here, Jacquelyn, let's make this actionable for people. What should we say are some action steps that people can immediately think about and do?
Yeah, I mean, so I think on the more general side, I would say think about planning for the team of people that would help you. Who are those people? How do you identify them? If you're interested in selling at some point and you want to talk to the M&A advisory panel that we have, people could reach out to you. People could reach out to me on LinkedIn, and we can give them a calendar invitation and they can set up that complimentary consultation with that panel that gives them, some options of kind of everybody we think they might need across the M&A spectrum. And then, Laurie, can you tell them action items from your side as well? Some things that you think people could do to gauge readiness and to prepare?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing is write down your number. Set a goal, whatever that number is. Have some reason for it. Write it down, put it in an envelope, and then set it aside. Now the hard work comes, which is to take stock of your business, because you have this number, you have this idea of what you think your business is worth, or the number you want to be able to lead a life of freedom in the future. But how are we going to get there? We have a gap. And so we have to take stock of your business. We have to understand, was it more valuable this quarter than last quarter, or this year versus last year? Have you baselined where you are today, not only in driving growth, but in creating value, creating enterprise value? And so there are differences there. There are trade-offs in making those calls. You might add headcount, important headcount, and that's going to lower your profits, but it may increase your enterprise value. So as I extended an invitation to you earlier, if you would like to take your PreScore, which is this personal readiness assessment, I also have an invitation if people want to take a business readiness assessment. And they can go to myvbscore.com, which is myvb, valuebuilderscore.com. And you'll take a 15-minute survey. Again, it's not painful, I guarantee it. And make a plan for the next 90 days. I mean, once you get your Value Builder score, I'll sit down with you and go over what it means and things to think about and understand some of the challenges you're facing and start to map out what are these big things that you should be working on for the future. And then the third thing, from a personal standpoint, is start to write down what experiences you want to enjoy after you transition from your company. So having this personal assessment, having this business assessment are two great ways to get started, and people are more than welcome to dive into that. So last but not least, Jacquelyn, I think just to, as you said, if people want to follow up with us, how do they get in touch? The M&A panel that we've mentioned a couple times, we are launching that in May, and it'll be available on your LinkedIn, my LinkedIn. If people want to learn more, they can certainly reach out to us directly, but they can be on the lookout for that. It'll be in the fourth Thursday of the month, every month, and we'll have a Calendly link for that where people can book a time. So that's exciting. And then, Jacquelyn, how do people reach out to you directly? How do they find you?
Yeah, so people are welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn, of course, or to look at my profile on our website, or to shoot me an email. My email is jcore, so JCORE @lynchlaw-group.com. It's kind of a long one. And my contact information is available on our website as well. And we'll post this on our LinkedIn. And so people, or if they're watching on LinkedIn, can certainly connect with us there. That's probably the easiest way.
Yeah, absolutely. And people can find me on my website, and all those assessments that I mentioned is SmallDotBig.com. And you could also connect with me here on LinkedIn. So thanks so much, Jacquelyn. It's always fun to talk to you. I love when we kind of do this riffing because we do different things, but we're in a shared world, and I really, really value your experience and your guidance. So
thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity. It is always fun.
All right, we'll talk soon. Bye.